The dry wind swept across the open prairie, carrying the scent of dust and sunburnt grass, and somewhere beneath the fading light of evening, a single figure staggered out from the wilderness as though torn from the very heart of the desert itself. She fell to her knees, her lips cracked from thirst, her skin painted with bruises and scars that told of battles fought in silence. For a heartbeat, the land held its breath. Then, from the edge of the creek bed, a man rose with his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, yet shadowed by the heavy silence of a past he never spoke aloud. His name was Reed, and for years he had walked through life like a ghost, bound to a ranch that echoed only with the hollow memories of laughter long buried in the earth. But that night something shifted. The stranger's gaze, dark and unyielding, locked with his, and in her trembling voice, strained by thirst and grief, she whispered words that would carve themselves into the marrow of his bones. "Let me live, and I will bear you children. Do not shoot." Time seemed to fracture in that instant, stretching thin between the grief of what he had lost and the fragile pulse of what might yet be found. Reed's heart stuttered in his chest, caught between instinct and longing. He saw not just a woman broken, but a warrior who refused to bow. Her shoulders, though trembling, remained straight. Her hands, though scarred, gripped tightly as if they could still shape a future from shattered pieces. He lowered his rifle slowly, as if surrendering to something greater than himself. With a silent gesture, he tossed his canteen toward her, the water within glinting like salvation under the last rays of the sun. She seized it, drank deeply, and when she lifted her head again, there was fire in her eyes that no storm could extinguish. They walked back to the ranch together, their footsteps uneven but somehow in rhythm, as though the land itself conspired to weave their fates into a single thread. Reed's ranch had long been a kingdom of solitude, haunted by the quiet moan of the wind through broken fences. Yet now, with her presence, the silence no longer felt suffocating. It felt alive, as if the earth itself exhaled in relief that two lonely souls had finally found each other. Inside him, old wounds stirred, the memory of his wife's gentle laughter, the echo of his son's small footsteps. But instead of breaking him, the ache softened, like healing rain on parched soil. That first night she did not sleep beneath his roof, but in the corner of the stable, clutching a knife as though the darkness still hunted her. Reed, leaning against the porch, watched her through the shifting glow of firelight. He did not call out. He simply stood guard, the way a man does when the safety of another becomes heavier than his own fears. In the stillness, he realized something unspoken. The woman was not merely a guest. She was a storm that had come to wash away the dust that had buried his spirit. And though she had said she could give him children, what she truly offered was something rarer, a chance to be whole again. The following dawn broke with a sky washed in soft gold. Reed stepped outside and found her already at the well, splashing water across her face, her hands roughened yet graceful. She worked with quiet strength, sweeping, repairing, tending to what was broken without waiting to be asked. A calf broke loose near the fence, and before Reed could reach it, she had already dashed forward, her limp ignored, her arms fierce as she wrangled the creature back into safety. Breathless, dust clinging to her face, she turned to him. And in that moment, with the sun crowning her like a halo, Reed saw more than resilience. He saw life itself refusing to be extinguished. Every small act she made stitched itself into the fabric of his lonely existence. A fire built in the yard, meat roasting over the flames, the faintest curve of her lips as she accepted a cup of warm milk he wordlessly placed by her side. Each glance, each silence carried weight. They did not need words to understand that something fragile yet unbreakable was taking root between them. What began as survival was transforming into something deeper, something healing, something the world outside would never comprehend. And here, dear friend, as you listen to the unfolding of their story, I invite you to feel the warmth of their beginning, not just in your mind, but in your heart. If this tale stirs something within you, if it brings a spark of comfort or a gentle reminder that even in brokenness there is beauty, I welcome you to leave a comment, to share your voice with mine. Your presence here, your support, is not just a number. It is the very energy that keeps stories like this alive. So, if you feel the touch of healing in these words, I ask you softly, press the like button, subscribe, and walk beside me as we continue this journey together. For love, in all its quiet beginnings, is meant to be shared, and your presence makes this story complete. From that moment, the ranch was no longer just Reed's burden to carry. It became the place where two wounded souls would dare to start again. And though danger loomed on the horizon, though shadows whispered beyond the fences, something had already changed. Two lives, once broken, now beat in rhythm with the same hope. And as the wind swept across the prairie, it carried not just dust and silence, but the promise of a love strong enough to outlast every storm to come. The morning light spilled across the prairie, soft and golden, painting every blade of grass with a quiet promise of renewal. Inside the ranch, the rhythm of a life once bound to silence had begun to shift. Reed awoke not to the lonely creak of his cabin walls, but to the faint scrape of a broom against wooden planks, the sound of water being drawn from the well, the subtle hum of life moving where emptiness once reigned. He stepped outside, boots crunching against the earth, and saw her already at work. She moved with purpose, though her leg still carried a limp. She did not wait for instruction, nor seek approval. Her hands were steady, her gaze focused, and every movement spoke of a spirit too strong to be broken by pain. Reed, a man used to solitude, found himself watching her far longer than he intended, something within him softening as though old scars were loosening their grip on his chest. The air smelled of fresh hay and damp earth from last night's storm. Reed carried his tools to mend the fence, but before he could act, a calf burst free, kicking up dust as it dashed toward the open field. His instinct was to run, but she was already there, springing forward with fierce determination. Her body, though weary, moved with surprising grace. She cornered the calf, guided it back, and latched the gate shut with a firmness that left Reed momentarily stunned. Her chest rose and fell with rapid breaths, sweat streaking her face, but her eyes burned with a fire that seemed brighter than the sun overhead. He met her gaze briefly and gave a single nod, an acknowledgment without words, a silent respect. Later, as the heat of the day thickened, Reed hammered posts into the earth, his muscles straining with each strike. He felt the familiar ache in his arms, the dull rhythm of endless work. But now there was another rhythm beside him, the scrape of her hands stacking wood, the quiet splash of water poured into buckets, the rustle of straw being swept clean. It was no longer the ranch of one man battling against time and emptiness. It was the shared pulse of two souls shaping survival into something almost tender. At dusk, she lit a fire outside the stable, arranging pieces of dried meat across the flames. Reed emerged with a tin cup of milk, setting it beside her without a word. For the first time, she looked at him with less guarded eyes, the sharp edges of suspicion dulling into something more open. They sat in the flickering glow, not as strangers, not yet as companions, but as two people who had begun to share the weight of silence together. That night, the wind carried the scent of rain across the fields. Reed, seated on the porch, felt the cool air against his skin and heard the faint clatter of wood inside the stable as she secured the door. He had lived for years with the ranch as his only companion, its silence both his refuge and his prison. Yet now, with her presence, the quiet no longer felt hollow. It was filled with the steady breath of resilience, the quiet hum of another heart learning to heal beside his. He closed his eyes and listened, not to the ghosts of his past, but to the subtle comfort of knowing he was no longer the only soul keeping watch over this land. When thunder rolled across the hills and the rain began to fall in heavy sheets, he found her curled in the corner of the stable, her forehead damp, her body trembling with fever. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, examining the wound on her leg, swollen and angry with infection. She clenched her jaw, but did not push him away as he heated a blade, lanced the wound, and cleaned it with steady care. Pain tightened her features, but she bore it in silence, her strength echoing through every shiver that ran down her spine. Reed wrapped the wound in cloth and laid a blanket gently over her shoulders. "Rest," he whispered, though his voice was more to himself than to her. Outside, the rain drummed hard on the roof, a rhythm of cleansing that seemed to wash not only the land, but something within both of them. As the fire in his cabin crackled, she appeared at the doorway, soaked from the storm, her blanket clutched tight around her. He motioned her inside, and she sat by the hearth, stretching her hands toward the flames. The light revealed the scars etched across her skin. The history of battles survived, the endurance of a soul that had carried too much yet refused to break. Slowly, haltingly, she told him of the sister she had lost, the captivity she had endured, the nights spent running until her feet bled. Reed listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the flames, until at last he spoke of his own losses. The fever that had stolen his wife and son, the emptiness that had hollowed his home. Between them, no promises were made, no soothing words exchanged. Only the fire burned, steady and warm, like a witness to two fractured hearts daring to sit in the same space without fear. When she returned to the stable, she left behind the old blanket she had carried like armor, taking instead the new one Reed had given her. He watched her go, and in the stillness he felt the invisible distance between them shrink. The ranch, once a place of mourning, had begun to breathe again, its silence carrying not grief, but the fragile warmth of healing. The next day's clouds hung low and heavy, but inside Reed there was a quiet certainty. Something had shifted, something had begun, and though shadows still lingered beyond the horizon, the land no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like the beginning of a story neither of them had dared believe could exist. The sun rose pale and heavy, its light filtering through low clouds as if the sky itself carried grief. Reed walked the northern fence line, boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The storm had passed, but its weight lingered in the silence. He knelt, fingers brushing the ground, and there he saw them, fresh hoofprints, deep and deliberate, curving close to the boundary before turning away. Not cattle, not local. The tracks spoke of men who did not belong, shadows pressing near the edge of his fragile world. His chest tightened, a memory of raids, of fire and ash from long ago. When he returned to the yard, Tina carried a bucket of water, her eyes sharp the moment she saw his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low. Reed's reply was curt, but his tone betrayed the storm brewing inside him. "Someone came close last night." She set the bucket down carefully, her gaze darkening with unspoken understanding. "They will come back," she said. Her hand tightened around the old knife she always kept within reach, its worn handle a reminder of survival. Reed studied her then, the determination in her eyes, the steadiness of her stance, even with her injured leg. He should have sent her away. Logic demanded it, but something inside him refused. "You can leave now," he said, his words heavy, deliberate, like stones dropped into a well. "If you move fast, they may not catch your trail." She did not argue. She did not beg. Instead, she bent down, tested the edge of the blade against her palm, and slid it back into its sheath. "I have been running long enough," she whispered. "If they want to come, I will be waiting." The quiet between them stretched, filled with a tension neither dared to break. Reed felt something shift deep within his chest, a bond that could not be explained by words, only by the way their gazes locked, steady and unflinching. Finally, he nodded. "Then we get ready." All that afternoon, the ranch became a place of preparation. Reed hammered wooden planks over the windows, reinforced the doors, and checked his rifle until the metal gleamed like cold fire. Tina gathered straw away from the cabin, stacked firewood into careful piles, and carried water with unwavering focus, despite the limp in her step. The work was heavy, relentless, but together they moved as though driven by one pulse. Their silence was no longer that of strangers. It was the shared stillness of two warriors bracing for the storm. By nightfall, the ranch was transformed. The cabin stood firm, windows dark, doors latched tight. Sandbags lined the porch. Reed sat with his rifle resting across his knees, the chair creaking softly under his weight. Tina took her post at the stable door, her spear grounded in the dirt, her shadow long beneath the faint glow of the lantern. Neither spoke, but their silence was filled with unspoken vows. A gust of wind swept across the prairie, carrying the faint scent of scorched grass from far away, as though the land itself sensed the danger drawing nearer. Reed's grip tightened around the stock of his rifle. Tina's spear caught the faint shimmer of starlight. Two broken souls, once alone, now sat together, guarding a home that had begun to mean something far more than shelter. The hours passed, and the night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes cried to the moon. Reed's thoughts wandered to his late wife and son, to the graveyard silence of his years alone, to the ache that had lived in his chest like a second heart. Yet when his gaze shifted toward the stable, where Tina's silhouette moved in patient vigilance, he felt that ache ease, softened by something unfamiliar yet undeniable. She was not his blood, not his kin, yet she was here, choosing to stay when she could have run. That choice alone felt like a balm, a healing he had not dared to seek. The following day dawned harsh and red, the sky blazing like fire over the horizon. Reed carried a box of nails into the field, and Tina followed with a bucket of water. The heat was merciless, pressing down on their shoulders, but they worked side by side, stretching wire, driving posts into the earth. Sweat streaked Reed's brow. The hammer bruised his palms, but he barely noticed. Each time he turned, he caught sight of her steady hands, the rhythm of her strength echoing his own. It was not just survival anymore. It was a strange, wordless companionship, a weaving of two lives into the same fabric of toil. At midday, the wire snapped back against Reed's hand, cutting skin, drawing blood. He hissed softly, but before he could move, Tina was there. "Let me see," she said, her voice firm yet gentle. She wrapped his hand with a strip of cloth torn clean, her fingers rough but careful, carrying both strength and tenderness. Reed's eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment time stilled. The sun caught the depth of her dark eyes, and in them he saw not only defiance, but a kind of fierce, unyielding care. He whispered, "Thank you." She said nothing, only returned to her work, but the silence that lingered between them was heavy with meaning. That evening, after the cattle had been herded back, they sat in front of the fire in the cabin. The air smelled of smoke and dust, the wood popping softly in the flames. Reed poured her a cup of coffee and handed it across the space. She sipped, set it down, and looked into the fire. Their shoulders were close, their breaths moving in quiet rhythm. Neither rushed, neither spoke, but when their eyes finally met, the truth passed between them without need of words. The kiss came unbidden, as natural as the setting of the sun. Soft, steady, without urgency or demand, it was the kind of kiss born not from passion alone, but from trust, from wounds slowly binding themselves into healing. When they pulled apart, the firelight danced across her lips, and Reed saw a smile flicker there, the first he had witnessed since she arrived. That night, for the first time in years, sleep came to him not as a burden, but as peace. Beyond the fences, shadows still moved, and the threat of riders lingered on the horizon. But inside the ranch, two souls who had once been shattered were learning to stand side by side, bound by something stronger than fear. And in the stillness, in the warmth of shared breath and firelight, they began to understand that love is not always born in calm. It is forged in storms, tempered in danger, and healed in the quiet choice of staying when everything else says to run. The afternoon sky stretched wide, heavy with a haze of dust, as though the land itself waited for what was coming. Reed worked in silence, his hands steady on the wooden frame of the porch, while his thoughts churned like storm clouds gathering far off. The kiss they had shared lingered on his lips, not fragile, not fleeting, but like a seed planted in the marrow of his bones. It did not take away his grief, nor erase the weight of years, but it softened them, reshaping loneliness into something he had not known in so long: hope. Inside the cabin, Tina tended the fire, the sound of the crackling logs carrying through the doorway. Each flame reflected against her bronze skin, her scars no longer shadows, but marks of survival, a quiet map of battles endured. Reed paused to watch her, not out of pity, but reverence. She was not a guest, nor a stranger anymore. She was becoming part of the ranch as much as the earth, the fences, the sky that stretched endlessly overhead. When dusk fell, the stillness broke with the sound of hooves approaching. Reed's chest tightened. He stepped onto the porch, Winchester in hand, every movement measured, deliberate. Tina emerged from the stable, spear gripped firmly, her stance upright, her gaze fierce. 3 riders appeared at the fence line, their faces marked with arrogance, their presence carrying the stench of violence. The leader spat into the dirt and sneered, demanding what he already knew. "Hand her over." Reed stood tall, shadow stretched wide behind him, and answered with the weight of steel in his voice. "There's no one here but me." Tina moved then, stepping into full view, scars bared, her spear steady, the fire in her eyes daring them to deny her existence. Reed's voice deepened, sharp as forged iron. "She stays. This is my land." The men shifted, tension slicing the air. A hand drifted toward a revolver, but the leader held it back, smirk curling as he muttered, "We'll be back." With a whirl of dust, they rode off, leaving behind a promise of violence. Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield waiting to ignite. That night, the ranch became a fortress once more. Together, they worked beneath the pale wash of moonlight. Reed nailed fresh planks across the windows, while Tina dug shallow trenches to guard against fire. Their movements were deliberate, ritualistic, every strike of hammer, every thrust of shovel binding them tighter in their shared vow. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Tina sharpened her spear, each stroke of stone against metal echoing like a heartbeat. Reed cleaned the rifle with a reverence that bordered on sacred. Their silence was thick, but it was not empty. It was the silence of trust, of 2 souls choosing to stand against the storm rather than run. When the rain came, it poured hard, flooding the earth, pounding the tin roof with relentless force. Reed sat by the table, rifle within reach, waiting with the patience of a man who had already buried too much. Then the barn door creaked. He rose, lantern in hand, and stepped into the downpour. Tina stood near the fence, soaked through, clutching a small bag. Her eyes glistened with defiance and sorrow. "If I leave, they won't hurt you," she said, her voice trembling yet strong. Reed's breath caught, anger and desperation mingling in his chest. "You think I would let you disappear?" His voice cracked like thunder in the storm. She turned away, pain in every line of her face. "I brought danger here. You don't owe me anything." Reed stepped closer, rain carving rivers down his skin. "Listen to me. I've already lost everything that mattered. My wife, my son, the life I thought I'd have. If you walk away, all that's left for me is another regret to bury." His words tore through the storm, raw, unguarded, stripped of pride. "I would rather lose this entire ranch than lose you." The bag slipped from her hand, falling into the mud. She froze, her chest rising and falling as though her heart itself fought against old walls. Slowly she turned back to him, her dark eyes burning not with fear, but with something fiercer, acceptance. The rain poured harder, drenching her hair, streaming down her cheeks like tears. But she did not flinch. "Are you not afraid of the price you'll pay for this choice?" she asked, her voice breaking open the last wall between them. Reed lowered his rifle, gripping her shoulders firmly. "No, because I am not alone anymore." The storm swallowed their silence, the land trembling beneath the weight of their choice. Tina let the blanket fall from her shoulders, no longer hiding, no longer running. Together they walked back to the cabin, rainwater dripping from their clothes, their hearts beating not in isolation but in unison. Reed threw more wood onto the fire, and the flames roared high, bright, like a beacon of defiance against the night. Tina sat by the wall, her eyes following Reed as he cleaned his rifle, and in that moment they were no longer two lost souls seeking shelter. They were allies, bound not just by survival, but by love carved in fire, in storm, in blood. At sunrise the horizon burned crimson, as if the earth itself was warning of what lay ahead. Reed stood on the porch with his rifle, the air tight with anticipation. Tina tied her hair back, her spear gleaming with sharp resolve. They did not speak, but in the stillness between them there was no need. The land held its breath once more, waiting for the inevitable clash. They stood side by side, not just as two people bracing against danger, but as one. Whatever came, they would face it together. And beneath the weight of that unspoken vow, the ranch, once a place of grief, became something new. A home born from courage, a sanctuary built from broken pieces, where love, fragile yet unyielding, dared to take root. The day unfolded beneath a sky the color of iron, heavy with heat, the light pressing down on the land until every shadow seemed etched into stone. Reed had risen before dawn, his instincts sharp as the sound of hooves still haunted his mind. He checked the rifle once more, polished the barrel until it gleamed faintly in the first glow of morning. Tina tied her hair back tightly, the spear propped against her shoulder, her face calm yet unyielding. Their silence carried no hesitation, only the steady rhythm of two hearts prepared for whatever storm would come. By midday, the air trembled with a distant hum, the low thud of horses galloping, the steady drumbeat of riders approaching. Dust began to rise on the horizon, curling into the air like smoke from an unseen fire. Reed set down the bucket he was carrying, wiped the sweat from his brow, and stepped onto the porch with deliberate calm. Tina emerged from the stable, the gleam of determination etched across her features, her scars lit by the merciless sun like badges of defiance. Together they stood as the riders drew close, the earth shaking with the weight of hooves. 5 of them this time, their revolvers glinting at their sides, their leader sneering with a malice sharpened by greed. "One last chance, old man," he spat. "Hand her over and keep your life." His words dripped with venom, but Reed's expression did not waver. He raised his Winchester slowly, the barrel catching the fire of the morning light. His voice carried across the dry air like steel dragged across stone. "You set foot past that fence, and none of you leave whole." The silence that followed was thick, choking, every breath measured. Tina stepped forward, shoulders bare, her spear steady, her gaze unflinching. She stood beside Reed, not behind him, her presence burning with equal strength. The leader's lip curled in disdain. "Then shoot, if you've got the guts." A rifle cracked, a sharp, merciless sound that split the stillness in two. The bullet slammed into the dirt near the rider's horse, sending the beast rearing with a scream. Dust erupted, chaos breaking loose as guns flashed. The air filled with thunderous shots, acrid smoke stinging the sky. Reed dropped behind the sandbags, returning fire with precision honed by years of survival. Tina moved like flame, spear flashing in arcs that gleamed against the sunlight, each strike carrying the weight of her past and the force of her will to endure. For minutes that stretched like hours, the ranch was transformed into a battlefield. Bullets tore into wood, splinters scattering, but Reed held steady, every pull of the trigger deliberate, every shot a vow to protect what had finally given him reason to breathe again. Tina's figure darted through dust and smoke, her strength fierce, her movements fueled by the fire of survival. Together, they did not falter, did not bend. Their fight was not just against men, but against the shadows that had haunted them both for too long. At last the riders faltered. One fell back clutching his arm, another cursed as his horse bolted in panic. The leader shouted, but his voice was drowned by chaos. Fear spread through them like wildfire, and within moments they turned tail, retreating in a storm of red dust and curses flung into the wind. Silence returned, broken only by the ringing in Reed's ears and the heavy rhythm of his breath. Smoke drifted across the yard, the acrid scent of gunpowder mingling with sweat and earth. Reed lowered his rifle slowly, his shoulders taut with lingering tension. Tina stood at the porch, her spear still clenched tight, her chest heaving. Their eyes met across the haze, and in that gaze was a truth more binding than words. They had faced the storm together, and together they had endured. When the dust finally settled, Reed stepped forward, his boots heavy against the scorched ground. Tina remained still, her hands trembling faintly now that the battle had passed. He reached out, steadying her hand with his own, and for a moment the world fell silent again, not with fear, but with the weight of survival shared. Her lips parted in the faintest smile, fragile yet radiant, and Reed felt his chest expand with something fierce, something healing. That afternoon, the sun softened into gold. They worked side by side, repairing the fence broken by stray bullets, hammering new posts into the ground as though reclaiming the land from the violence that had tried to consume it. The sweat on their skin shimmered in the light, their shadows stretching long across the earth. When the work was done, Reed leaned against a post, his body weary, but his spirit unshaken. Tina came beside him, her wide, scarred hand finding his, calloused fingers intertwining without hesitation. "This ranch," she said softly, her voice steady despite the ache lingering in her bones, "is mine now too." Reed turned to her, eyes filled with the fire of quiet conviction. "And you are not going anywhere." As the day bled into dusk, they sat together on the porch steps, the glow of the fire inside the cabins spilling across the yard in warm flickers. The silence was no longer a burden, but a balm. The prairie stretched wide before them, but neither felt its vast emptiness. For the first time in years, Reed knew this land was not just soil and fences and endless labor. It had become a home, built not from walls or wood, but from the courage of two broken hearts daring to trust again. And as the stars climbed above them, shimmering across the dark sky, their presence side by side was enough to heal what the years had tried so hard to destroy. The prairie lay quiet under a sky washed pale by the morning sun. But beneath that calm, the earth carried the scars of the battle that had raged only hours before. The air still smelled faintly of gunpowder, and the fence posts bore the marks of stray bullets, splinters scattered like brittle reminders of how close the shadows had come. Reed rose early, his body aching from the strain, but his spirit carried a steadiness he had not felt in years. The house no longer seemed haunted by silence. Every sound, the creak of the porch, the soft splash of water at the well, the low hum of cattle, felt alive again, carrying with it the rhythm of two hearts rebuilding what violence had tried to shatter. Tina moved through the yard with quiet grace, her spear now resting not as a weapon in constant readiness, but as a sentinel by the door. Her hands, though scarred, handled the work with patient strength. She stacked firewood, drew fresh water, brushed down the horses, each motion deliberate, each task performed as though to remind the land itself that it had survived. Reed watched her from where he mended a post, the sun catching strands of her hair and turning them into burnished copper. He felt a warmth stir in his chest, not the wild heat of passion alone, but a gentler flame, the healing kind that seeps slowly into broken places until they are whole again. At midday, they paused their work to share bread and coffee beneath the porch's shade. Reed handed her a tin cup, their fingers brushing lightly, the touch simple, yet charged with something deeper. For a long time they ate in silence, the kind of silence that no longer weighed heavy, but instead rested like a blanket across their shoulders. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the steadiness of one who had endured storms and chosen not to be defined by them. "I once believed I would never find a place to belong," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Reed's chest tightened, but he answered with a quiet certainty, "You already have." The afternoon passed with the rhythm of labor, nails driven into wood, ropes tightened around posts, sweat shining across their brows. Yet amidst the work, small moments glimmered with something far more precious. When a calf slipped and Reed moved too slowly, Tina was already there, steadying the creature, her laughter ringing low and warm as it stumbled back into safety. When Reed's grip faltered under the strain of lifting a beam, Tina's hand joined his, her strength surprising him, their combined effort enough to set the weight in place. Each act stitched them closer, weaving their lives into one seamless thread. That evening, the air softened with the fragrance of wild sage carried by the breeze. They sat before the fire inside the cabin, the flames casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Reed poured her a cup of warm milk, the same quiet gesture he had once offered when she first arrived. This time she did not look away, did not guard herself. Her lips curved into the faintest smile as she accepted it, and Reed felt the small flicker of joy ignite into something fierce. Their eyes met across the glow, steady, unwavering, as though both understood without needing words that something sacred had been born from the ashes of their pain. Later, as the fire dwindled into embers, she leaned against his shoulder, her body warm against his, her breath slowing into the rhythm of rest. Reed sat still, his arm carefully circling her, the weight of her presence grounding him in a way he had long forgotten. He listened to the sound of the night, the crickets, the sigh of wind through the rafters, but beneath it all was the steady beat of her heart, a sound that healed wounds too deep for words. For the first time since the fever had stolen his wife and son, he felt the ranch was no longer a tomb. It had become a sanctuary, lit not only by fire, but by love daring to grow in soil once barren. When dawn broke again, the horizon glowing with hues of rose and amber, Reed and Tina stepped outside together. The ranch stretched before them, scarred but standing just as they were. Her hand slipped into his, calloused fingers intertwining with his own, and in that simple act was the unspoken vow that neither storm, nor fire, nor shadow could sever. The land was no longer his alone, no longer a prison of grief. It was theirs, a place reborn through courage, trust, and love that had found them when they had least expected it. And as the wind swept gently across the fields, carrying with it the scent of earth and promise, they knew they would face whatever tomorrow held, not as two broken souls, but as one. The horizon burned crimson as dawn gave way to a day that felt heavy with unspoken prophecy. The land itself seemed to shiver, the tall grass bending beneath a wind that carried with it the faint scent of smoke and steel. Reed rose before the first light fully touched the earth, his Winchester gleaming from the care he had given it the night before. He stood on the porch, broad shoulders squared, the weight of past grief carved into every line of his face, yet steadied now by something more powerful than solitude. Beside him, Tina tightened the leather binding of her spear, her dark eyes clear and unwavering, her hair tied back so that nothing would hinder her sight. They exchanged no words, for none were needed. The silence between them was filled with a vow neither had spoken aloud, but both had already chosen. They would not yield. The sound of hooves began as a whisper, faint, like thunder buried in the distance, then grew louder until the earth itself trembled beneath their rhythm. Dust rose in violent spirals, and through it 5 riders emerged, revolvers glinting at their sides, eyes sharp with menace. The leader smirked as he reined his horse before the gate. His voice carried across the yard, slick with cruelty. "One last chance. Hand her over and walk away alive." Reed lifted his rifle, the barrel catching the light of the morning sun, and the steel in his voice cut through the air. "You set 1 foot past that fence, and you won't leave whole." The riders laughed, cruel and sharp, but the laughter was brittle, and it died when Tina stepped forward. She did not hide in the shadows, did not let him stand alone. Her spear gleamed, her bare shoulders etched with scars that spoke louder than any words. She stood beside Reed, her presence a declaration in itself. She was no prize to be taken, no shadow to be erased, but a warrior who chose to remain. Reed felt the fire in his chest tighten into something fierce, unshakable. They were no longer 2 souls surviving side by side. They were one force, unbreakable. The first shot cracked through the silence, splitting the air with deadly precision. A bullet struck the wooden post by the gate, splinters flying. The horses screamed, the riders drew their guns, and in a heartbeat the ranch became a battlefield once more. Reed dropped behind the sandbags, returning fire with steady aim, each shot an oath of protection, each pull of the trigger a defiance of the darkness threatening to swallow them. Tina moved with a grace born of survival, her spear slicing arcs of silver through the dust, her every movement honed by years of struggle. Gunpowder thickened the air, burning the lungs, but they did not falter. Reed's rifle spoke again and again, his breath even, his eyes sharp, honed not by rage but by necessity. Tina fought close, her body weaving through the chaos, striking with strength that belied her frame, her hands steady even when bullets shattered wood around her. They moved as one, the rhythm of their survival in perfect harmony, the bond between them stronger than any weapon their enemies carried. Minutes stretched into eternity, the thunder of hooves and the flash of gunfire melding into a single storm. One rider fell, another cursed and pulled back with his arm bleeding, the leader shouting orders drowned by chaos. and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tide broke. The riders turned, retreating in a storm of red dust, curses and threats flung behind them like arrows without weight. Their figures blurred into the horizon until only silence remained. Reed lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving with breath, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease at once. Tina stood nearby, her spear still clenched, her knuckles pale with strain. For a moment neither moved, their eyes locked in the haze of smoke and dust. And then, like the breaking of a dam, relief surged between them. They had not only survived, they had endured together. The yard bore scars of the fight, splintered wood, trampled earth, the scent of smoke still heavy. But amidst the ruin there was life. Reed reached out, his rough, calloused hand closing gently over hers. Her grip tightened, strong and certain. The corners of her lips curved into a smile, small yet radiant, the first true smile he had seen upon her face since the day she stumbled from the wilderness. It was not victory alone that brought it forth, but the realization that neither of them was alone anymore. That evening, as the sun melted into gold across the horizon, they worked side by side, repairing what had been broken. The hammer struck wood in rhythm with the sound of her laughter, soft, surprising, like water after drought. Reed paused often, watching her from the corner of his eye, marveling at the way her presence made the ranch feel whole again. When the work was done, they sat on the porch steps, their shoulders brushing, the sky above ablaze with stars. Reed leaned back, his gaze lingering on the constellations, but his heart fixed firmly on the woman beside him. In the quiet, Tina's hand found his once more. No words were spoken, for words were too small for what had been born between them. The silence was warm, soothing, healing, a silence that cradled rather than crushed. For the first time in years, Reed did not feel like a man guarding ashes. He felt like a man standing at the threshold of a new life, one built not from promises or illusions, but from the courage to hold on when the storm raged loudest. And as the night deepened, their breaths rose and fell together, bound to the truth neither would ever again deny. Love, fierce and unyielding, had taken root in the most unlikely soil, and from it a new beginning had already begun to bloom. The sky at dawn flamed with colors of rose and ember, the horizon glowing as if painted in fire to mark the beginning of something neither Reed nor Tina had ever believed they would live to see. The land was hushed, holding its breath in reverence, carrying the quiet after a storm that had tested not only their strength, but the very core of who they were. Reed stood on the porch, rifle still within reach, though no longer clutched with the desperation of fear. His eyes swept across the fields, scarred yet standing, and for the first time in years he saw not ruin or emptiness, but a home reborn. Beside him, Tina tied her hair back as she always did at the start of each day, her spear resting by the door not as a symbol of endless battles, but as a reminder that she had survived them all. Her scars caught the rising light, glowing not as wounds but as marks of triumph, a testament that healing does not erase the past, it transforms it into strength. They began their morning as they always did now, with quiet labor done together. Reed mended a stretch of fencing that had been broken by gunfire, his hands steady, while Tina drove posts into the earth with firm strikes that echoed like a heartbeat through the yard. The rhythm of work no longer felt like burden, it felt like harmony. Two lives entwined in the soil, in the wood, in the breath of the land. When Reed's hand slipped against a rough board, she was there, binding the scrape with cloth, her touch both firm and gentle. When Tina paused to wipe sweat from her brow, Reed offered her water, his gaze lingering with warmth that carried no hesitation anymore. Each act, simple and unspoken, bound them tighter, weaving together what grief had once torn apart. By afternoon, the cattle moved lazily in the pen, the prairie stretched wide, and the air was filled with the fragrance of wildflowers blooming after rain. Tina's laughter rang clear when a calf nuzzled against her side, unsteady on its legs. Reed found himself smiling too, a rare expression that had once belonged only to his past, now freely given to his present. They sat beneath the porch's shade to share bread and coffee, their shoulders brushing lightly, and though the silence stretched, it was a silence filled with comfort, as though words were no longer needed to confirm what had been sealed in battle and in firelight. As dusk approached, they finished their tasks and watched the sun sink beyond the hills. The golden light painted everything in hues of honey and amber, softening the edges of the land and of their hearts. Tina leaned against Reed, her head resting on his shoulder, her eyes closing with the ease of someone who had at last found safety. Reed's arms circled her naturally, his touch protective yet tender, his heart steady in the realization that this woman, fierce and scarred, had given him back the life he thought he had lost forever. The ranch no longer whispered of ghosts. It breathed with new warmth, carrying the music of two souls daring to begin again. That night, the fire inside the cabin burned low but steady. They sat together close to its glow, hands clasped, eyes reflecting both exhaustion and peace. Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly, but inside those walls the world was small, intimate, filled with the promise of tomorrow. Reed traced the curve of her hand, calloused fingers brushing against hers, and Tina's lips curved into a smile that glowed brighter than the flames. In her gaze, he saw not only survival, but belonging, not only resilience, but love. They had not chosen each other with words or promises. They had chosen each other in the heat of battle, in the storms that had tried to break them, in the silence that had once felt empty, but now overflowed with presence. Love had come not as a whisper of romance, but as a fire forged through pain, healing, and unshakable trust. And in that truth lay a beauty greater than anything Reed had ever known. That true love is not found in perfection, but in two broken hearts that refuse to let go. As the stars bloomed across the sky, scattering light over the wide plains, Reed and Tina sat on the porch steps, gazing outward, not at danger, not at shadows, but at a horizon that finally felt open and kind. Their hands remained clasped, their breaths falling in harmony, their silence filled with warmth. The ranch, once a monument to grief, was now a sanctuary of healing, a home crafted not by walls or fences, but by love itself. And, my dear friend, if this story touched your heart, if it brought you even a spark of warmth, or reminded you that healing is possible even in the harshest places, I invite you to walk with me further. Press the like button to keep this fire alive. Leave a comment to share what you felt, and subscribe so we can continue to journey together through stories of love, courage, and hope. Your presence here matters more than you know. It is the gentle light that keeps these tales breathing. Together, Let us carry this warmth into tomorrow.